In the heart of West Africa, where the Sahara's dust meets the lush green of the savannah, lies a nation whose name resonates with defiance, Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. Its history is one of kingdoms, colonial conquest, revolutions, and endless struggle for sovereignty. It is here, in this crucible of hardship and resilience, that a young man named Ibrahim Traoré would rise from humble beginnings to become one of the youngest heads of state in the world. His story is not just about politics, nor simply about war. It is the story of a people who yearned for dignity and a leader who dared to carry their burden on his shoulders. Ibrahim Traoré was born in 1988, long after the legendary Thomas Sankara had electrified Africa with his fiery speeches and radical reforms. But though Sankara had been assassinated a year before his birth, his spirit still lingered in the conversations of the elders, in murals on city walls, and in the whispered dreams of those who long for a leader unafraid to defy the powerful. Ibrahim grew up in a Burkina Faso that was fragile and uncertain, where poverty was widespread and the promises of past leaders had faded into cynicism. His family lived simply, like millions of other Burkinabe families, enduring the droughts, the meager harvests, the long nights of insecurity that defined village life. From a young age, Ibrahim was known for his seriousness. While other children played without worry, he listened intently to stories of soldiers, of revolutions, and of resistance against foreign domination. School was not easy, resources were scarce, classrooms overcrowded, but he excelled. He had a sharp, disciplined mind, one that refused to settle for mediocrity. Education, he knew, was not just a personal escape, but a duty. If he succeeded, he could lift not only himself but his family and perhaps, in time, his people. Drawn by both curiosity and a deep sense of purpose, he entered the military academy. In Burkina Faso, the army was not just a profession, it was an institution that had shaped the nation's destiny since independence. Presidents had risen and fallen through coups. Soldiers were feared, but also respected, because in a country where institutions were weak, the army was one of the few pillars of strength. Ibrahim embraced its discipline with vigor. As a cadet, he earned a reputation for humility, seriousness, and an ability to stay calm even in the most difficult situations. When he graduated and began his service, Burkina Faso was facing one of its gravest threats. The Sahel region, stretching across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, was being torn apart by jihadist insurgencies. Groups linked to al-Qaeda and the Islamic State exploited weak borders, corrupt governments, and desperate populations to spread their ideology through violence. Villages were attacked, markets burned, and thousands fled their homes. Soldiers on the front lines faced ambushes in unforgiving deserts, often with outdated weapons and little support from the state. Ibrahim was deployed to some of the most dangerous regions. He lived among his men, sharing their rations, their fears, and their exhaustion. He fought in brutal battles where survival was never guaranteed. But he never complained. To his comrades, he was not a commander who barked orders from behind safety. He was one of them, willing to walk into danger by their side. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He believed that soldiers should not only fight for their lives, but for the dignity of their people. Over time, a quiet respect grew around him. In the barracks, among ordinary troops, Ibrahim Traoré was admired as a man of integrity, a rare quality in a country where corruption had seeped even into the army. While senior officers enriched themselves in the capital, he remained focused on mission. The more he saw of the battlefield, the more he realized the rot eating away at Burkina Faso was not only external, it was internal, bred by leaders who had abandoned their people. By 2022, the country was at a breaking point. President Marc Christian Kabore had already been overthrown earlier that year by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, who promised security but failed to deliver. Damiba's rule quickly lost legitimacy as insurgent attacks spread further. Entire regions slipped from state control. Soldiers were dying by the dozens, and civilians were left unprotected. Rumors spread that Damiba was negotiating secret deals with terrorists instead of confronting them. For many soldiers, this was unforgivable. Within the army, whispers began to grow louder. Someone had to act. And among the names that surfaced, one was repeated again and again: Captain Ibrahim Traoré. On the morning of September 30th, 2022, Ouagadougou woke to gunfire. Military convoys rolled through the streets, blocking access to government buildings. Smoke rose in the distance. The people of the capital, already accustomed to instability, braced themselves for yet another coup. By nightfall, the nation's fate had shifted once more. On national television, a group of stern-faced soldiers announced that Damiba had been deposed. At the center stood a man in fatigues, barely 34 years old, calm but resolute, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The announcement sent shockwaves far beyond Burkina Faso. In a single day, the world's youngest head of state had emerged, toppling a senior officer and taking control of a nation in crisis. For the people, it was a moment of renewed hope. Crowds poured into the streets, cheering, waving flags, and chanting his name. They had been disappointed so many times before, yet something about this young captain felt different. He was not a general from the old guard, nor a politician wrapped in luxury. He was one of them, young, battle-tested, and unafraid to take risks. But with power came a heavy burden. Expectations soared. The people wanted security, prosperity, and dignity, and they wanted it fast. The international community looked on with suspicion. Some called him a hero, others dismissed him as just another soldier in Africa's cycle of coups. But for Ibrahim Traoré, there was no turning back. He had taken the mantle of leadership, and now the weight of a nation rested on his shoulders. The first thing that struck the world about Traoré was his simplicity. Unlike leaders who adorn themselves with luxury, he appeared in plain fatigues, often dusty from the field, speaking in direct, unpolished language. He did not hide behind protocol. In meetings, he looked foreign diplomats in the eye and told them what many Africans had long wanted to say. Enough of neocolonialism, enough of interference, enough of being treated as children. His message resonated deeply in Burkina Faso and across Africa. He invoked the legacy of Thomas Sankara openly, declaring that Burkina Faso must reclaim its sovereignty and chart its own path. To many, it felt as if the spirit of Sankara had returned, embodied in this young soldier who dared to speak truth to power. One of his most dramatic moves was the expulsion of French troops. For decades, France had maintained military presence in its former colonies, claiming to fight terrorism, but accused by many of protecting its own interests. Traoré accused France of failing to defeat jihadists while meddling in Burkina Faso's affairs. In a bold and unprecedented decision, he ordered them out. To some, it was reckless. To others, it was the most courageous act of defiance in years. But Traoré did not stop there. He turned to new allies, particularly Russia, for military support. He strengthened ties with neighboring Mali and Niger, both led by military juntas also defying Western influence. Together, they envisioned a new Sahel alliance, a bloc that would resist neocolonialism and take security into their own hands. For critics, this was dangerous isolation. For supporters, it was the first real step toward independence. Inside Burkina Faso, he launched reforms to empower local defense groups, giving villagers the means to defend themselves against insurgents. He pushed for investment in agriculture, urging Burkinabe to produce their own food instead of relying on imports. He insisted that government officials abandon extravagance and live simply. These were bold policies, but implementing them in a country ravaged by conflict and poverty was a monumental task. Challenges mounted quickly. Terrorist attacks did not stop. Sanctions from regional bodies like ECOWAS hurt the economy. International aid dwindled. Inflation rose and urban protests began to surface. The burden of leadership was crushing. But despite everything, Traoré retained immense popularity among ordinary people. His humility, his closeness to soldiers and villagers, his refusal to enrich himself, these qualities set him apart. The world began to debate, was this young man the real heir of Sankara, destined to reshape not only Burkina Faso but Africa itself? Or would he fall like so many before him, crushed by the weight of expectations, betrayed by allies, or consumed by the very system he sought to change? When Ibrahim Traoré first appeared on national television on the evening of September 30th, 2022, many in the world struggled to even pronounce his name. To them, he was a mystery, a young captain who had seemingly come out of nowhere. But for the people of Burkina Faso, especially the soldiers who had fought and bled beside him, this was no surprise. For months, his reputation had been building quietly, whispered in the barracks, discussed in hushed tones at checkpoints and camps. He was the man who shared their hardships, the man who had spoken truths others dared not say. And now, in one dramatic sweep of events, he had stepped into the center of history. The days that followed the coup were tense. Paul-Henri Damiba, the ousted leader, did not immediately surrender. Loyalists within the army resisted. For a moment, Burkina Faso stood on the edge of chaos, torn between two military leaders. Damiba fled to a French base, where he sought refuge, sparking outrage among Burkinabe who already suspected him of collusion with foreign powers. In fiery speeches, protesters surrounded the French embassy, demanding Damiba's removal and denouncing foreign interference. Eventually, Damiba resigned, and the path was cleared for Traoré to consolidate power. But consolidating power was only the first step. Leading a broken country was far harder. Traoré inherited a nation plagued by insurgency, a fractured army, an economy under strain, and a population exhausted by decades of betrayal. Unlike seasoned politicians, he had no decades of political maneuvering behind him. He had youth, he had conviction, and he had courage, but could these alone sustain him against the enormous challenges ahead? The new president wasted no time in declaring his vision. His speeches were fiery but straightforward. He called on the people to reclaim their dignity, to stand tall as Burkinabe, to no longer bow to foreign masters. He spoke of food sovereignty, of producing what they consumed, of building schools and hospitals with their own hands. His words ignited passion, especially among the youth. In villages and towns, murals of his face appeared, painted alongside the heroic visage of Thomas Sankara. For many, it was as if history had looped back, offering a second chance at the revolution that had been cut short in 1987. Yet words alone would not defeat the insurgency. Traoré turned first to the battlefield. He reorganized the military command, purged corrupt officers, and redirected resources to frontline units. He launched recruitment drives, swelling the ranks of the volunteers for the defense of the homeland, a civilian auxiliary force meant to protect villages. Critics feared this would arm untrained civilians, leading to abuses. Supporters argued it was the only way to defend vast rural areas abandoned by the regular army. Then came his most controversial move. He ordered the withdrawal of French troops. For nearly a decade, France had maintained soldiers and special forces in Burkina Faso, claiming to fight jihadists. But to many Burkinabe, their presence was an insult, a reminder that independence had never been complete. Traoré echoed this sentiment, accusing France of hypocrisy, of prolonging instability for its own gain. In a bold, almost theatrical move, he gave them weeks to leave. The decision reverberated far beyond Burkina Faso. In Paris, officials fumed. In Washington, analysts fretted. Western media painted Traoré as reckless, a pawn of Russia, or an inexperienced populace playing with fire. But in Ouagadougou, the decision sparked jubilation. Crowds marched with Burkinabe flags, chanting anti-colonial slogans. They saw in Traoré the spirit of Sankara reborn, the courage to say no to the old masters. Of course, expelling France left a vacuum. Traoré turned eastward, forging ties with Russia, which was eager to expand its influence in Africa. Russian advisors arrived, military equipment was promised, and propaganda outlets championed Traoré as a hero of anti-imperialism. To his critics, this was merely swapping one master for another. But to his supporters, it was strategic pragmatism, better to diversify allies than remain chained to a single patron. As weeks turned into months, Traoré worked tirelessly to maintain both military and popular support. He traveled across the country, meeting soldiers on the front lines, sitting on mats with villagers, eating simple meals to show he was one of them. Unlike other leaders who hid behind walls, he walked among the people. Photographs of him kneeling beside wounded soldiers or addressing crowds without barriers became powerful symbols. Still, the challenges were staggering. Jihadist attacks continued, striking deep into the countryside. Entire regions remained ungovernable. The economy, already fragile, groaned under the weight of sanctions imposed by ECOWAS, the regional bloc that opposed military coups. Inflation soared, making food and fuel scarce. Teachers went unpaid. Discontent simmered in cities, even as rural populations largely rallied behind the young leader. Traoré faced another dilemma: how to balance freedom with security. Independent journalists began to complain of intimidation, and some opposition figures accused him of authoritarian tendencies. But in the eyes of many Burkinabe, such criticisms were minor compared to the larger battle for survival. They judged him not by the standards of Western democracies, but by the urgency of their needs. Could he protect them from violence? Could he restore dignity? Could he feed the nation? Meanwhile, Traoré's stature grew beyond Burkina Faso. In Mali and Niger, where military juntas also ruled, his boldness inspired admiration. The three countries began coordinating more closely, sharing intelligence, conducting joint operations, and presenting a united front against both jihadists and international pressure. For the first time in years, some spoke of a Sahelian awakening, a movement to reclaim sovereignty from foreign powers. Traoré, barely in his mid-30s, was at its center, but the weight of history pressed heavily on him. He was acutely aware of the parallels with Sankara, whose radical reforms had ignited hope but also provoked enemies, leading to his assassination in 1987. Traoré often invoked Sankara's memory, but he also knew he had to learn from his downfall. Where Sankara had isolated himself through uncompromising stances, Traoré sought to be more flexible, building alliances even as he pushed his nationalist agenda. Yet danger lurked everywhere. The jihadists were relentless, foreign powers were displeased, and internal rivals waited for him to stumble. The young captain had seized power in a blaze of courage, but could he hold it? For ordinary Burkinabe, these questions were not abstract. They lived with the daily consequences of insecurity. They buried their dead after attacks, they struggled to feed their children, they prayed for peace. To them, Traoré was not just a politician. He was a gamble, a fragile hope in a land where hope had been betrayed too many times. Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power was not only a military act, it was the birth of a new narrative for Burkina Faso. As weeks turned into months after the coup, the story of the young captain began to spread across Africa and even beyond. International journalists, activists, students, and ordinary citizens all debated the same question. Who really was this man, and what would he do with the power he had seized? To some, he was a patriot, a revolutionary heir to the unfinished mission of Thomas Sankara. To others, he was simply another soldier in a long line of African leaders who had come to power through coups, destined to repeat the cycle of promises and betrayals. The truth was more complicated, and it was still being written day by day. Inside Burkina Faso, Traoré's leadership took on an almost mythical quality. The country had endured endless cycles of broken promises, of politicians who had sold themselves to foreign powers, of generals who lived in luxury while their soldiers went to war without food or boots. Traoré's image, by contrast, was built on sacrifice and humility. He continued to live modestly, earning the respect of both the poor and the military rank and file. Stories circulated of him visiting wounded soldiers at night, or of him sleeping in the same tents as his men. Whether every story was true or exaggerated did not matter. The legend of Ibrahim Traoré was growing, and that legend itself became a political weapon. But legends do not shield a country from bombs or bullets. The jihadist insurgency raged on, stretching the army thin. Traoré understood that if he was to survive politically, he had to show real progress in security. His strategy became twofold: intensify military offensives and restructure alliances. The army began to launch coordinated strikes against militant strongholds, supported by newly recruited volunteers. Villages that had been abandoned were slowly reoccupied. Sometimes victories were small, a convoy reaching a besieged town or farmers being able to plant crops for the first time in years, but each success was magnified, each reclaimed road or school presented as a symbol of resilience. At the same time, Traoré deepened ties with Mali and Niger, two countries that shared Burkina Faso's struggles against insurgency and Western dominance. The three juntas began meeting regularly, and soon an unprecedented alliance emerged, the Alliance of Sahel States. Together, they declared that their destinies were linked, that they would resist external pressures and build a common defense. For many in the Sahel, this alliance was electrifying. It gave them a sense of unity that had been absent for decades, and Traoré, despite his youth, was at the center of this experiment. Foreign powers, however, were less enthusiastic. France, already expelled, watched nervously as its influence crumbled in a region it once dominated. The European Union criticized Burkina Faso's shift toward Russia, while the United States issued cautious statements about democracy and human rights. But Traoré framed these criticisms as proof that he was on the right path. When you are attacked by those who once exploited you, he declared in one speech, it means you are reclaiming your freedom. His words resonated deeply not only in Burkina Faso but across Africa, where many still carried the scars of colonialism. Economically, Traoré faced an even steeper challenge. Sanctions imposed by ECOWAS and the suspension of international aid strangled the country's already fragile economy. To counter this, he emphasized self-reliance. He encouraged local food production, invested in small-scale farming projects, and promoted artisanal industries. While these measures could not transform the economy overnight, they carried symbolic power. They echoed the Sankarist principle of self-sufficiency, of producing what one consumes, of rejecting dependency on foreign aid that often came with strings attached. In the capital Ouagadougou, young people began to speak of Traoré with pride. Students painted murals of him in revolutionary poses, markets sold T-shirts bearing his image, and musicians wrote songs celebrating his defiance. His popularity was not universal. Some urban elites, business leaders, and older politicians viewed him as reckless, but among the poor and the youth, he was increasingly seen as a figure of hope. Yet hope alone could not erase the darker realities. Reports of civilian casualties in counterinsurgency operations mounted. Villages accused volunteers of committing abuses. Journalists who criticized the government faced harassment. Human rights organizations warned that the enthusiasm for sovereignty was being used to justify repression. For Traoré, this was a delicate balance. Too much freedom could invite destabilization. Too much control could erode his legitimacy. His answer was often pragmatic: focus on the greater struggle, silence dissent when necessary, and justify it as a sacrifice for survival. By the time his first year in power approached, Traoré had become both a symbol and a target. Jihadists issued threats against him personally, foreign media scrutinized his every move, and internal rivals waited for him to falter. But his youth, once seen as a liability, became an asset. He was relentless, energetic, and unburdened by decades of political baggage. He spoke the language of the people, and he seemed genuinely committed to their cause. What made Traoré unique was not just his policies, but his ability to embody the collective frustration of a nation. He represented defiance against an international system that many Africans felt was rigged against them. He represented the possibility that dignity could be restored, that sovereignty was not just a word in history books, but a living reality. Whether or not he would succeed was uncertain, but for the moment, he had captured the imagination of millions. As his leadership entered its second phase, Traoré began to look beyond immediate survival. He spoke of rebuilding the state, of investing in education, of creating industries that could employ the restless youth. He hinted at constitutional reforms, at a transition to civilian rule, though always with the caveat that security must come first. This ambiguity frustrated some, who accused him of clinging to power. But many ordinary Burkinabe preferred a strong leader in uncertain times over a fragile democracy that could collapse at the first sign of crisis. Traoré's international image also continued to evolve. In Africa, he was hailed at rallies in Mali, Niger, and even further afield. Pan-Africanist movements embraced him as a hero of the new generation. Conferences in Dakar and Accra debated whether the Burkina model could spread, whether young soldiers elsewhere might be inspired to challenge entrenched elites. In the West, however, skepticism persisted. Analysts questioned his ties to Russia, his democratic credentials, and his ability to deliver lasting change. To them, he was a temporary phenomenon, a charismatic soldier whose star would fade. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the perception was different. For the first time in years, they had a leader who did not bow. As the second year unfolded, Traoré's government announced ambitious initiatives, literacy campaigns in rural areas, infrastructure projects to connect isolated villages, and health programs to combat malaria and malnutrition. None of these projects were easy to implement, given the financial constraints, but each represented a step toward restoring the state's presence in neglected areas. In his speeches, he framed these efforts not as charity, but as the right of the people, declaring that dignity began with access to education, health, and food. Still, the insurgency remained the greatest test. Every victory was followed by setbacks, every offensive met with counterattacks. Villages were burned, civilians displaced, soldiers killed. The war was grinding, brutal, and seemingly endless. But Traoré's leadership style kept morale from collapsing. He appeared at funerals, stood in the trenches, and made it clear that he shared in the sacrifices. His image as a soldier leader, not a distant ruler, was his greatest strength. And yet, beneath the surface, dangers loomed. Coups are often followed by more coups, and history showed that leaders who came to power through force often fell the same way. Could Traoré escape this cycle? Could he build institutions strong enough to outlast him? These questions haunted both his supporters and his critics. By the third year, Traoré's place in African history was being debated as if he had already completed his mission. Some declared him the second coming of Sankara, the man who had finally revived Burkina Faso's revolutionary spirit. Others warned that he risked dragging the country into further conflict, isolating it from the international community. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. But one fact could not be denied: Ibrahim Traoré had changed the narrative. In a world where African leaders were often portrayed as puppets of foreign powers, he stood defiantly as his own man. Whether he would succeed or fail, he had already inspired millions by daring to reclaim sovereignty. His story was still being written, in the dust of the Sahel, in the hopes of the youth, and in the struggle of a people who refused to surrender. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou, the chants of his supporters echoed through the streets, mixing with the calls to prayer and the drums of distant villages. They were chants of resilience, of defiance, of belief that even in the harshest of times, a leader could emerge who spoke their language, who carried their dreams, who embodied their fight for dignity. Whether history would remember Ibrahim Traoré as a savior, a tyrant, or simply another chapter in the long saga of Burkina Faso, one thing was certain: his name would not be forgotten. For in him, the people saw themselves, not as victims of history, but as its authors.